All right. Welcome to the fifth installment of the Heritage Orchard Conference's 2020 webinar series. Today, our presentation is going to be moderated by David Benscoter of the Lost Apple Project, and our keynote speaker today is Daniel Bussey. And go ahead and take it away, David.
All right, thank you. Yeah, this is one of my favorite speakers for the conference. Most of us, when we pass away, it's going to be the last time that anybody thinks of us. But I'll tell you what, Dan has produced a work of art that is going to it's going to last for ages and ages. Dan is the author of the illustrated history of apples in the United States and Canada. It took Dan over 30 years of research and writing to create this masterpiece. If you have not had the opportunity to read it or to see it, I'm going to show you a little bit. Here is one volume. It's actually a set of 7 volumes that contain over 16,000 named varieties of apples in the United States and Canada. Also, just a little plug here, it has been marked down to the incredible price of $150, which is usually about the price you pay for one textbook at a university. So if you want to know where it is, look up Jackhaw Press. That's the only book they sell, and it's just a wonderful book. Dan also was the orchard manager for over 24 years at the Seed Savers, and I just love this guy. I know you're gonna love what he has to say for you today. Go ahead, Dan, take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. Yeah, actually, I was at the Seed Savers for 6 years. I was a cider maker and other things for 24 years. Not that it makes much difference, but I've been growing heirloom apples since the late 70s. Actually, 1980, I think, is when I planted the first tree. And I suppose it's kind of a long story about how it all started. And I know that's what some people wanted me to talk about. I blame this. You get a chance to see this. This is the book that drove me crazy and probably has ruined my life, but you know, here we are. Apples and Man by Fred Lape came out in 1979. I had just gotten married and I was living with my in-laws at the time to save money. So we're going to start building a house the next year. And there was a book review in the old Country Journal magazine, Blair and Ketchum's Country Journal. I don't know if any of you remember that, but it was a popular magazine in its day. It's long gone now. And it talked about all these old apples. And I thought that was kind of interesting, something different. And so I sent for it. And it's one of those things, it's one of those cliched moments that sort of like when you read it, it's like, this is really something and I have to do something about this. The book talked about just how apples developed in this country, where they came from, and what really caught me were the names of them. The names were just so crazy. Blue Pearmain, Red Astrachan, White Transparent, Black Amish, you name it. And I thought, well, that's really fascinating. And so I had come from my old family farm. That's where I grew up. And my dad built a house that was in the middle of the old farm orchard. And so as a kid, I was always surrounded by these big old apple trees. And at the time, of course, when I'm a little kid, they were just fun to have around, had a swing set in one. And when there was apples falling off the trees, it was great to pitch at my brother and beat him on the head with them and, you know, just stuff. But one of my early memories is that in the fall, my dad would say, let's go grab all the apples we can get off the ground and take them down to the local cider mill. And we had a community press, which was really, I've come to realize now, a great thing. And so every cardboard box and bucket we could find, we packed with apples and threw it in the back of the family station wagon and ran down about 8 miles to a little town called Newville. And we would get fresh cider made. And my folks had these big gallon glass jars that you could get at the time. and put cider in them. And then she would, I think, can some or eventually freeze some. But my dad would always take at least one of those jars and leave it out on the counter with the cap loose until it started working. As you know, how about fermenting it? So it was, he didn't add anything to it. And it was really fun to see that bubbling, swirling mass that was in that jar, and to taste it. And so it wasn't really hard at that time. It was just pretty much effervescent. But the fun thing about it is then going back all these years later, after I started making my own cider and then tasting it for the first time, and that memory kicked in about what it tasted like. And it was just, it just rang home to me what a wonderful thing that was. And so when I got a hold of this book, it kind of brought me back to that time. And I decided I needed to plant some of these trees that they talked about. And in the back was a very brief listing of the few nurseries that carried heirloom apples, because in the 70s, there wasn't much interest in that. Everybody was going after all the things, all the newer varieties. And so the heirlooms were sort of out there, not particularly common, but you knew it existed, but you just didn't know much about them. So the catalog I sent to, which was considered one of the best of the time, was for a little nursery run by a German man by the name of Otto Baum. Had a nursery in New Fairfield, Connecticut. And it said you should send for this catalog and get it. And so I did, and I got it. And I still have the copy of it here after all these years. And he was selling trees for $6.50 and all these different varieties. And it just blew me away. It was one of these catalogs that was sort of typed out and then handwritten and mimeographed, and it was kind of put together rather clumsily, but it got to the point. It mentioned a name, where it came from, and just a very brief coded description of kind of what it was. And that kind of intrigued me. And it was really from that point that I got hooked on heirloom varieties, and I've never looked back. And it's been a fun time, something I've really enjoyed. My mom used to take me around to the local orchards in southern Wisconsin, which is where I grew up. And we would get whatever apples we could find. So I got to know the standards of the day. I don't think we ever bought Delicious, though. That was not one variety we never seemed to touch. But we got Duchess and Transparents and a number of different ones. And it was seriously fun. Then all those years later, when I had my own place, I was able to start planting trees. And I just started collecting, and I just never quit. The point where I packed trees in every little spot I could on my place. I had a couple of acres, and I was able to purchase a few years later about 4 acres just to the north of me. And my plans were, of course, then I wanted to plant fruit trees there. And so to be able to get trees the way I wanted, there were a lot of varieties that I weren't able to get, but I could get cuttings. So I had to learn how to graft. And so that led into all kinds of new troubles. And so I was able to then collect signwood. And the first year I grafted 10 trees, and I got 8 to take. So I figure any fool can do this. And it's one of those things that the more you know, the harder it is. And so when you learn how to graft, the fundamentals are simple. And I really suggest anyone who doesn't know how to graft, it's a wonderful thing to do. When you learn how to do this, you can go so many places with it. So you can graft all kinds of things, conifers and different other fruit trees, of course. You can graft tomatoes, which is, I guess, a thing that you're maybe starting to see in the garden centers. Working at the Seed Savers, we used to grow a lot of heirloom varieties. And so sometimes they're not particularly great growers. And so if you put it onto a root, tomato root that was more vigorous, you could increase your production. So grafted tomatoes have become very popular. So anyways, it's been really a lot of fun. Let me see if I can change my screen here. I see a note saying that I'm.
I don't think that's anything that you're able to change.
Okay, if I can't change it, good. All right, good to know. Anyways, keep digressing here. But so as I was starting to collect these apples, I wanted to know more about them. You know, where did they come from? And it was kind of hard to know. There weren't too many books in the library about it that I could find, at least locally. But I had gone to University of Wisconsin in Madison. Now, that's one of the old land grant colleges that was established around the time of the Civil War. And so it had materials from almost all states in the Union, a great collection of horticultural literature. And my dorm was right by the ag campus, and that's where I had my study halls. And so I'd spend a lot of time there because it was definitely quiet. My roommate was a DJ for the local radio station, and so I had to get out of there all the time to be able to have some sanity and study. I can't take noise when I'm trying to concentrate. Anyways, and I realized back in the library there were a lot of really great old books. One of which was, I think, the first book that I really ever spent much time with is a copy of John Ashton Warder's American Pomology Apples. It was done in 1867 out of Cincinnati just after the Civil War. And it is a fabulous collection of apples. And so the fun part about all of this is learning where to find information. Because at that time, there were no internet libraries. I had to just find them wherever I could. So I basically rifled the shelves at the library, the Steenbach Library, for a name for it. I got to the point where I'd go up there about every weekend and grab a grocery sack full of books. Being a Wisconsin resident, they would allow you to take books home with you, even if I wasn't a student. And so I'd be up there practically every Friday grabbing a sack full of books and going through them and just to find what little tidbits of information I could. And I had a notebook that I was trying to write this all down with. So yeah, I lived a rather boring life, working all week and then spending the weekends pawing through books. But that's kind of where this all began. It was really fascinating to me. And the thing about books is in the back, there's always a bibliography that tells you what other books you can find. So I didn't know the apple literature at all, but basically through finding all these bibliographies, it led me to this source and to that source. And from there, it kind of came to be. So I had the bright idea that maybe I should collect this and put it on a computer. At that time, I bought the state-of-the-art 286 computer with a 40 megabyte hard drive. I think someone called it something close to amnesia as far as memory. But that's what I had. And I bought a word processing program called WordPerfect. And I'm still using WordPerfect today, version 10 or something like that now. I think it's out there. But I love it. I love it better than Microsoft Word, sorry. But it's when you get used to something, you know, I stick with it. I really like it. So it's just started collecting material. And it just kind of grew from there. So that's the long and short of it. What possessed me to do this, I don't know, but it was just fascinating because the names really were something. It was so fun to find a variety and to know as much about it as you could. Where did it come from? And generally, there was always a name attached to it, and try to find whatever kind of a description. And it got to be pretty good. And so at that time, I started going to the Seed Savers Exchange in Decorah, Iowa. In 1989, they had just planted their own orchard, which was, I think, around 750 varieties that they had, mostly on dwarf stock called P22. So the trees were only 5 or 6 feet tall tops. And to me, that was just like Mecca. I mean, it was a fabulous place to go see all these old varieties. And it was really something. And the interesting thing about it is these trees were planted, and a lot of them, of course, the graft unions got a little bit too low to the ground. And so there ended up being a number of trees that ended up not being dwarf trees, but got to be full-size ones. So runs the gambit there. And a lot of the original trees are still there, even on that dwarf stock. But the interesting part of it also is they had put up a heavy steel rod that helped to support the tree and also had a name tag attached to it. So you have to consider the fact that you're in the middle of the Midwest, on top of a hillside, with these 10-foot tall metal rods sticking up above the ground. And every time there's a thunderstorm coming out, bad things happened. So we have more than a few lightning struck trees up there that I've had to deal with over time. And so once I started working there, one of the things I did was to remove as many of those poles as possible. Some of the big ones had actually grown around the pole and it's enveloped into the trunk of the tree. So, well, whoever has to cut any of those down, they will find a big steel pole in the middle of them. But anyways, that was fun. And so when I got to work there, the amount of varieties had dropped to about 550. And by the time I left in 2017, and now I'm retired, I think there was about 1,500 different varieties total. Something pretty crazy, but it's still fun. The fun thing, of course, is writing about the varieties. The best part, though, being able to eat them and know what they're like and know what they're talking about. I'm so enamored with the old varieties. There are some that are just so absolutely fantastic. If you've never had a chance to try them, they're incredible. They really are. And so my favorite, of course, are the English russet varieties, the Ribston Pippins, the Lord Hindlips, Ashmead's Kernel, and Pitmaston Pineapple, all those wonderful ones that just are so fabulously rich and flavorful. And it's really fun. So the climate of Iowa here in southern part is about a 4B, 5A. So we can grow most things pretty well. It's not too bad. But when you read about the historic literature of apples, you realize how much stuff was brought into this country. I mean, of course, all the varieties here have been brought in from somewhere originally. And so that's the fun part, is starting to trace back where all these varieties came from originally. Some of the earliest documented apples that came into this country were known to a few people. There's a English clergyman by the name of Richard Hakluyt. He's actually, it's a Dutch family, but he settled in England and was a clergyman there. And he was very much interested in promoting travel to the New World to find what's going on there. And anyways, he was asking all the sea captains, okay, what kind of provisions are you taking and whatnot? So one of the earliest apples that ever got to North America was an old variety called the Dusson. It's an old French variety. And so anyways, this was dating back to 1598. And so a lot of the sailors were taking that variety with them. You have to think, well, okay, Dusson is sort of a derivation of Duans, which means 2 years. 2 years means that when you put this apple in your hold, it would last for 2 years in storage. So what does that tell you about the kind of apple it was? Probably pretty tough, pretty dry, and it wouldn't rot. So you could take it with you and have something fresh to eat, because that was kind of a premium, being able to have something other than beans and salt cod or something like that. So that was one of the early varieties. So when we start looking at what was coming over, there are several schools of thought of what got here first in the New World. The Vikings are supposedly bringing stuff down into, say, Nova Scotia in the 1600s. The French were coming here very early on, but also in the West, a lot of stuff was coming up through the mission districts from Mexico into California. So between the three, and they were all about the same time. That's the interesting part. And so we don't have a lot of written records from the West. That's unfortunate, but we do have a lot more documentation from those things that were brought in from the East. So we can work with that. So the French settled, of course, through basically upper North America, because the British were farther to the south. And so along the Great Lakes and all the way down the Mississippi, the French had moved in and settled, and they brought varieties with them. The variety Fameuse, also known as Snow in the upper Midwest, that most of us know it, or I certainly know it by. It's been around all that time, and that was a seedling of something that the French had brought in. So when you look at maps and you see the names of different towns, like Lafayette, Indiana, that was a French settlement. Detroit is a French settlement. Down the Mississippi, there are various cities that have French names. So the French had a large influence about what came into the United States. And then later on, of course, mostly settlers came in for the fur trade, for getting beaver, and so they were trading with the natives for rights to trade their products for pelts. And so the French had the sort of the upper hand in the upper Midwest. And then later on, the British sort of won out because they ended up paying better, from what I understand. They were willing to offer a little bit more for their pelts. So it was a very dependent economy between the natives because they really loved the trade goods that they were able to get. And we were certainly happy to get the beaver pelts. So that was a big thing. And then you also then in New England, that was also fighting for the trade. So the new Swedish company came into areas of, I think, New Jersey, part of Pennsylvania, Delaware. They were settling there first, and eventually were sort of pushed out by the Dutch who came in. And so you have old varieties like Vandeveer, which has a Dutch name, but actually the original name was Stalcubs, which was a Swedish name. So it was actually a Swedish variety that sort of got superseded by the Dutch that came in later on. So there's a lot of interesting history that kind of goes with all this. But so anyways, reading about all this stuff, it kind of takes over your life, and it's really fun to really kind of get into more about the history of these varieties. And that's sort of what I've sort of focused on lately. Those of you who have seen a copy of my book will know there's a lot of stuff in there. But what I'm working on now, which is really fun, is every single name that's in that book, I'm researching who they are, where they came from, and finding out their story in life. There's an old saying that I'm going to use for, I think, the dedication in my book. It's taken from a Polish poet by the name of Czesław Miłosz. It's a quote from the Montreal Gazette, and it says, "The living owe it to those who no longer can speak for themselves to tell their story." And so what I'm working on now is trying to tell that story. Focus more on the people that brought out these varieties and where their place in history is, because there's some fascinating histories, if that's the sort of thing that you like to know. And I see the little questions that are coming up here, and yes, we're going to address those. And Duans, of course, Dusan, they're all very similar. The funny thing about a lot of the early material is there was a lot of phonetic spellings. If you heard it, if you didn't see it written down, you heard it. And what you heard is how you would write it if you had the chance to. And you have to realize in this country, a lot of people were very illiterate. They had no idea how to read or write, but they could speak and they knew what they were saying. And so when someone copied that down later on, that was the best interpretation that they had on things. So there's a lot of material in this country that is spelled in a myriad of different ways. And it's been fun to sort of sift all of this down. So my interest, of course, a lot is the apples, of course, but the names have really have stuck in my head. And so it's been fun to really go over it, because I find in the historic literature that there have been lots of little mistakes in spelling and things that I am trying to fix. There's a lot of really crazy stuff that's out there. But I'm going to get into the point where I tell a few stories about some of the varieties and little bits about the people that are around them. So anyways, I guess I got a pet peeve that's going on right now. There's a variety out there called Cole's Quince. And if John Bunker is listening to this, I know he might find this interesting. Cole's Quince, of course, is a wonderful apple. And why it was named Cole's Quince is because there was an existing quince variety already out there that was from New York State. The New York apple had synonyms like Seneca Spice and Seneca Sweet, I think. But the Cole's Quince came about a little later. So it was sort of known as the Quince of Coles. And that was from Captain Henry Coles from Cornish, Maine, if I have that right. Anyways, I'm starting to see websites that are showing the fact that this Cole's Quince originated about 1806. And that's totally incorrect. It isn't right. What happened was there was a book that came out not too many years ago, actually, just a couple of years ago, that unfortunately moved the Coles quince and the old quince together. And it's just totally wrong. They're actually two different apples completely, two different seasons. They have different tree habits as well. And the Coles quince is an earlier season apple, and the New York quince is a much later, and it's a good keeping apple. There was a date of 1806 thrown toward this, and that was taken from, let's see, there's a book that came out, Bernard McMahon's American Gardener's Calendar in 1806 that mentioned this variety. Well, if you really want to get particular about the old quince, I found a date of 1771 when it was offered in the William Prince catalog from Flushing, New York. Flushing is now part of Queens, and he was offering it even then. So John Bunker, that is, had put a date of about 1830, which is about right. It was known by 1840, but they're completely different apples. So those are the little things that I'm trying to go over, and not just say, no, they're different, but say why they're different. What's the reason that I have? And I have the documentation then to be able to make that happen. So every single entry that I have in this book, I'm going through it. Is there a name there? And a lot of times there were varieties that were so-called introduced by a particular gentleman, but the name is not his. So when I start looking back at it, I will look in the neighborhood using census records and find out that actually he got the variety from a neighbor of his. Case in point, there was a guy by the name of William Springer. He is the man credited with introducing the iconic Wolf River apple, an old Wisconsin variety that a lot of people know about. It's a big pumpkin of an apple. Two of it can make a pie. It's good for drying. It's not particularly juicy, but it's just a monstrous apple. There aren't too many that are bigger than that. Well, anyways, some of the old stories have him being a Quebec lumberman that came along the Great Lakes, and when he got down to the bottom of Lake Erie, bought some apples from a vendor, these big old apples that were thought to be Alexander. And then when he got to his place in Fremont, which is in the central part of the state on the east, in from Green Bay, he planted seeds of this and it came up. Well, Springer wasn't a Quebec lumberman. He's actually from New York. He worked in Quebec now and then doing lumbering, but so the stories start to get a little messed up. And that's some of the fun of going back and really tracing their history and finding out what really is the story. One of the old stories was about the Wolf River is that it grew up in blue clay soil on the east bank of the Wolf River, hence its name. Well, what comes down to it is I tracked back, where did William Springer live? He lived on a place called Partridge Lake near the Wolf River. It had been attributed possibly to a farmer by the name of Jacob Stiegler, according to the literature. Well, actually the name was Steiger. They'd already misspelled his name. His farm was on the east bank of the Wolf River, where it supposedly came up from. So we might have to revise where this came from. William Springer was a nurseryman, and he would collect varieties from all around his neighborhood in Wapaka County. And it's been fun to go back to old maps, and I can find out where each of those farms was, where he got those varieties. So there's Cassie's Sweet, there's a Bennett apple, there's a number of different ones that he gets the credit of introducing, but they actually were seedlings that had grown up on these small farms. That happens more times than you care to know. So I'm going back to finding out, where did these apples really originate from? And all credit due to those who introduced them into the trade. But I really like to go back to find out where they really did come from and to honor those families who really brought them out. So anyways, this is obviously a project that isn't going to get done overnight. I've spent better part of a year just working on the letters A through C, and I'm just about done with that. There's that much material, but the fun part is the crazy stories that you run into. I'll mention a couple. There's a variety of apple I ran into by the name of Blondin. Came out of New York State in the early 1840s. And I thought, well, that's a rather strange name. So I looked anywhere I could to find anything about a Blondin apple, and there isn't much in the literature. But when it comes down to it, there's no family name by that in that part of New York State where it came from. But it turns out in that same year, there was a man plying his trade over Niagara Falls on a tightrope. He was known as the Great Blondin. And this apple was then named after him the year that he was doing this over Niagara Falls. So that's the fun little things that you run across. I don't believe the Blondin exists. If it does, that would be fun, because those are the fun stories that go along with it. There's another man by the name of Oliver Hazard Perry Lear. He was from Hannibal, Missouri, which is already a problem. But if you learn back, Oliver Hazard Perry was Commodore. He was named after Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry, who during the War of 1812 was on the Great Lakes defending the Americans from the British. And so he was fairly well known. And the strange thing is that's quite a moniker to have. But I found there are more than a few people with the name Oliver Hazard Perry and whatever their last name is. Well, this guy, Lear, was big with the Missouri Horticultural Society, and he was apparently quite a character. Anyways, I was able to find his grave marker, big granite, blocky monument. And he married a woman who was about 15 years his junior. Well, he passed on, and about 15 years later, his wife did. Anyways, there's a new inscription that was put into the monument at the base that says, "He was a man. She did what she could." So I think that's kind of fun. That says a lot without saying a lot. So funny things like that. There's an old, another variety called Moderator. I might have the name a little bit messed up, but that's the family name. When people came over to this country from wherever they did, they really wanted to integrate into American life. And that was just before the Civil War. And so Moderator had come from Switzerland, and his son was old enough to enlist when the Civil War broke out. And so anyways, he served. And here's a hard look story. His unit was captured, and he spent a fair bit of time in the Andersonville prison in Georgia. And if that wasn't bad enough, he got out and was nursed for a little while to kind of bring his health back. And so he was able to then catch a ride to head north on the steamboat Sultana. If any of you know your naval history, you'll know that the Sultana was one of the worst maritime disasters in the United States. Well over 1,000 people were killed. They were heading up the Mississippi during the spring floods. And if you're aware of how crazy the water can be in the Mississippi, which is near where I live here, and they can be pretty treacherous. Well, this steamboat had 4 boilers in it, and the boat would list from side to side. The boilers were tied in such a way that the boat tipped really far to one side, it would drain out the boilers to the other side. And then when it swished back again, all that water came rushing back into that dry boiler and caused a steam explosion, which blew up. It was an absolutely horrible disaster. Well, anyways, the son survived. He survived this, but only died a few years later from his wounds. He never did completely recover. So is this important to apples? I don't know. But I think when you learn the history of these families and what they had to go through, I think it makes you appreciate what it was like at that time. So that apple also, I don't believe exists, but it would be nice to know. So one of the things that's really kind of fun to understand is, and why I'm doing this, is that when apples come into this country, of course, all our ethnic ancestors would typically bring things with them that they were familiar with in this life, back in the home country, I should say. And so they brought fruit varieties with them that they knew from home and would try to grow them here. So that's why we have so many different apples that were from Europe. It was really fun. got to know a good friend of mine, Nicholas Howard, who was the DNA geneticist from the University of Minnesota that was actually able to identify the parents of the Honeycrisp apple, which is a cross of Keepsake and Sweet 16. It was actually wrong when they first came out with it, what they thought it was, but he was able to figure out what it was. And we've corresponded quite a little bit, so I supply him with the historical documentation. He found an apple in western Iowa that had obscure origins using DNA sampling from a very odd German apple. And, like, how did that get there? And so when I look at it, well, it was a German family. He had moved up from a German community in Ohio to western Iowa where this apple was found. And so when you have a community like that, they brought things with them, and that makes perfect sense of how it came about. So one of the fun things I think that we're looking forward to is that we find out where people came from and where they moved to. Because one of the projects I know an Apple group is working on right now is doing DNA sampling. And there are a lot of varieties that come up, unique unknown, I think is the terminology for it. So if we can find unique unknowns in different locations, like Kentucky, and then all of a sudden it shows up in Indiana or it shows up in Montana, we can figure out that these were, and they show, the same characteristics. We can figure out, okay, this was a known variety that moves. So it helps us to be able to identify it. Also part of dealing with the record of apples is getting a lot of the names straight. When it comes down to it, guys got all the credit for the apples they introduced. I mean, that was pretty typical. In Minnesota, there was a whole series of apples called the Perkins apples, and they were planted by Mrs. T.E. Perkins. Her name was Rhoda. I mean, usually it's always Mrs. and then the initials for the man, but Mrs. Perkins planted all kinds of seedlings from the Melinda apple and came up with 109 different crosses of varieties, and a number of those were named. One of my grandfather's favorite apples was the Perkins apple, and I have it. I found it. It's one of those things. But in many cases, you have to understand that the guys got the credit, but it was the women that planted the trees to begin with. So we have to owe a lot of credit to people who really brought out these varieties, not just the guys that got the credit for it. So that's going to take a little while to sift out, but give credit where credit is due. Anyways, but the Perkins seedlings were a lot of fun. They got really well known. They were picked up by a number of nurseries in Minnesota, and that's really fun. One variety that it's nice to know a little bit about it. There's a variety that's out you guys' way, the Spokane Beauty. If you've heard of it, yeah, that's one that David and I were talking about the other day. And the family came out from New England, who eventually ended up settling out there in Walla Walla after the uprising was settled out. Well, anyways, I found out that Stephen Maxson and his wife came to Wisconsin. They both had family there. Stephen had some family in the little town of Albion, which is a mile from where I grew up. And his wife had contacts with her family, which was named Babcock, which was in a little town called Milton, about 8 miles away. And so the family that introduced the Spokane Beauty, they were just basically in my backyard for a couple of years before they headed out west. So that's kind of fun to see where they came from and where they moved to. So that has been kind of a joy. Let's see. Now, it would be really fun to be able to, when we're in the process of identifying some of these varieties, is to have something to go on, because there are a lot of times there's just a name, there isn't even a description. And so we try to figure out what these varieties are. So that's going to contribute to the unique unknowns, of course. I happened to be a delegate for the slow food movement in Turin, Italy, a couple of years ago. And the host family that I stayed was kind enough to try to get me to tour around, and they knew I had an interest in apples. And so they located a museum that was nearby. I guess his son went to a school, and the director of the school says, "Oh, you should stop at the fruit museum." Going, "Oh." So anyways, we made contact with them, and it's called the Musea del Frutta. It's in Turin, and got a chance to go in. It's not open generally to the general public, but I got to go in. And in the collection are life-size wax models of hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of apples. We used to do that in this country. A lot of the historical, or I should say, horticultural societies would have collections of these wax fruits. University of Illinois in Champaign campus had a large collection, and there were many of the old Russian varieties that were brought in basically in 1870 that they're gone. They don't know what happened to them. They got melted down for candles or something. But anyways, they don't exist. So those that are pretty rare. There are some in collections, I guess. A lot of them were made in Germany, but they were really done. And the fun thing about this museum is, of course, there's just shelf after shelf of all these unique apples. And there's a number of American varieties there. I have a file of, I guess, all of them, so it's kind of be fun to look at. But the museum shares space with another museum in the other half of the building. It's a museum of criminal anthropology. So on the one side, you've got the skulls of convicted criminals who did horrible things, and you've got models of apples over on the other side. It's a really strange juxtaposition, and it kind of sounds a little Freudian to me about those who study and spend way too much time with apples. But anyways, I'll leave your mind to wander with that. I guess as long as I have a captive audience here, I'm going to make another sort of a pronouncement here too. There's an old variety called Clark's Orange. It has been attributed to being a southern variety. I hate to burst people's bubbles, but it's actually from Wisconsin. I'm sort of possessive about that. What happened is I guess Creighton Lee Calhoun and Old Southern Apples was writing about it, and he was saying that the American Pomological Society in 1897 were talking about this particular variety, and they decided it was from Ohio. Well, I paged through the entire American Pomological Society records for 1897, and actually it was a variety from Wisconsin. A man by the name of George Peffer introduced it. He was a nurseryman, one of the early settlers of a little town called Pewaukee, which is just west of Milwaukee. Anyway, so what happened is his reference is from T.T. Lyon, who was the director of the South Haven Experiment Station. And he got a hold of a cutting of this apple from Ohio. And so he sort of assumed it was from Ohio, but he hadn't done his research to find out where it actually really came from. It dates back to the 1840s in Wisconsin, and it was very popular in the Midwest, and it was moved around. And so that's where it came from. And I happened to get a copy or a picture of the Clark's Orange in, I'm trying to remember what catalog, I don't know if it was Horn Creek or something like that. And it's exactly the same thing. So I want to put that one to rest too, if I can possibly help it. So I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there it is. So let's see, getting back to, if you really want to learn the history of varieties, I mean, that's certainly something that most people don't care about. Why would you want to know these things? I think it's really fun. For those who are growers and marketers, it's really nice to, when you're growing a variety, is to be able to tell your customer about it. And a lot of people like that touchstone of the history of a variety and anything that you can find about it. So I think it's a good marketing tool. It's something that you can use to, customer information is always good. I think you connect with your people that much better. So knowing the varieties and the history of them, I think is really a great sales tool. So I'll throw that plug in there. I was president of Wisconsin Apple Growers Association many, many years ago, and I was probably the weirdest grower of all of those, because I was growing all the old stuff where nobody was doing that. It was pretty amazing. So I got to know people, but it was all about marketing. That's really what it comes down to. So when you're growing this stuff, and if you're growing it for yourself, that's great. But when you're growing it to sell, it's really good to know as much as you can about it to be able to tell your customers this. I think it just fills in a void that they otherwise would have. So how are we doing on time? I'm rattling on
You're
here.
doing great.
Good.
You're doing great. Do you want to answer a few questions now, Dan?
Sure, love to.
All right. Well, let's start off with Bridget. Bridget's from England, and she writes, there's a fantastic array of cultivars in the United States that we in England never get to sample. How would a global apple enthusiast diversify into some U.S. varieties to preserve for future and from climactic or catastrophic weather events?
Okay, that's a good one.
Is that something that you can address?
Beg your pardon?
Is that something that you can address?
I think I can attempt to. I know in this country, we're always trying to get those things that we don't have. And so we're always trying to import varieties, usually from Europe, to bring here. I mean, we did that years ago. And so I know the reverse can be true. There are a lot of places that I think would be happy to send out cuttings, but you have to sort of deal with the phytosanitary requirements of anything that goes out of the country. Even to Canada here, we cannot really just send a cutting in the mail because that's just it's not legal. We don't want to mess around with that. So there are collections. There's a man by the name of Derek Tolman from Burnwood Fruit Trees in Ludgershall. And he had made a trip to the this is in Australia or New Zealand, I forget which, where there was a great apple collection there. A lot of stuff from the States and a lot of stuff from Europe that was there that actually had been lost in England. And he was able to bring a lot of those things back, a certain number of cider varieties. He's a font of knowledge. If you've not met him, he's just amazing. So that's one source, and he may know the particulars about being able to bring things back into your country or wherever you want to grow. I am lucky enough to have a complete or almost complete set of all the USDA plant importations from the 1890s, I believe, to fairly almost like year 2000. And you should see all the stuff that got brought into this country from everywhere. And so it's kind of fun to track those varieties down. Do they still exist? A lot of those things were brought then to the plant introduction stations at Glendale, Maryland, maybe some at UC Davis, but and then a lot of stuff ended up in Geneva, New York, of course, but different experiment stations. So it's really kind of fun. It was an interesting, I noticed in the late 30s, just before the outbreak of World War II, the USDA was bringing in apple varieties from Europe by the hundreds. There are just tons of different ones. I think they had a real fear that they may be lost because of the war, or they just seemed to have a bent for making sure that they got them ahead of time. So that was a really interesting revelation to see that. But anyways, that's besides the point. I'm just drifting here. I don't know the particular mechanics of having to do that, but yeah, you will have to talk to your agricultural department, I guess, to find out what is the best process. A lot of times in this country, it's pretty lengthy. They bring it in, they will grow it out, they will test for diseases, and you would think that everything is everywhere. It isn't necessarily true, and we just don't want to bring in anything that has bad stuff here, and nor would you want it where you are too. I don't know if that helps, but
maybe checking with the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Geneva, New York, that might be a possible way to go.
Yeah, that would be a possible way to go. The Geneva collection is under a little bit of a quarantine right now because they had some issues with fire blight this past year. So they actually weren't even sending out any cuttings this year. And that's a terrible loss, but I hope that they can get through that. It's really difficult. I've been there, and it's the most fabulous collection in the world. It's just, well, the Brogsdale station in England is also there. I've yet to visit it, but it's really amazing. Okay.
Okay, we have also Don Ricks. Hi, Don. Don writes, the Hawkeye apple was a chance apple in Peru, Iowa in 1872. This was the forerunner to the Red Delicious and is important to the state of Washington. Do you know if the original Hawkeye apple is still alive in Peru, in Peru, Iowa?
It exists. Original Hawkeye was a striped apple. It had more stripes to it. The variations since then have gotten all over the place. Interesting story about that. Jesse Hyatt was a Quaker. Anyways, he had an orchard. He had introduced previously a Hyatt Black and a Hyatt Sweet. Well, they were thinking that the Hyatt Black might have been a sheep nose apple, which would have been the black gilliflower. And so it had that same sort of telltale shape. He also had another variety, oh, I'm trying to remember the name of it now, from New York State. Anyways, it also had a similar shape to that. The book that I mentioned, Apples Man, has a little story about the fact that both have very hard, bitter skin and fairly insipid flesh, that the gilliflower, the black gilliflower and delicious were somewhat alike. Well, anyways, this was a seedling that came up. They didn't know, they can't remember for sure if it was a failed graft and this was the root that came up, or it came up in the fence row nearby. They cut it down a couple of times, and Jesse Hyatt finally said, well, if thee must grow, let thee. That's a quote that has been attributed to him. And so he brought it up and he thought it was really a neat apple. It was really pretty. So he sent some down to the fruit show in Louisiana, Missouri that the Stark brothers had put on. And the Stark brothers got it and they just thought it was just a fabulous apple, but they lost the tag for it. They didn't know who it came from. So they just hoped and prayed the next year's fruit show would show up something. And sure enough, Jesse Hyatt sent a barrel of apples down there and they were able to get a hold of it. But the funny part of it is he sent it down there because all the local nurserymen didn't like it. They didn't care for it. They didn't want to propagate it. They thought he was crazy. And so he ended up sending elsewhere and it really got picked up and the rest is history. The fun part about it is that the Red Delicious replaced an equally despised and loved apple called the Ben Davis, which for 100 years prior to that was the most popular apple in this country. And it had lots of issues, a tough, hard old apple, but it was sure beautiful, bright red. It's that color that really got us. You know, you could pack barrels of it and send it overseas on a boat to England where they loved them there. I don't know, but the Red Delicious is more of a southern variety. It likes a little bit more warmth. It exists. The original Hawkeye does exist. It is in the Seed Savers orchard. It's out there. It was supposedly named Hawkeye, although I don't think it never was commercially known by that at all, but it's out there. Since then, Red Delicious has this knack of throwing out genetic sports, slight variations in a branch or a whole tree sometimes, where it colored up a couple of weeks earlier. It had more of a solid color rather than a blush. And so it was, over the years, selections were made to have that apple that ripens sooner, because if you could get your apples to market a couple of weeks quicker than the guy down the road with the same variety, you could clean up. And so we selected Red Delicious for a lot of reasons, none of which were for flavor. So it can do well in some places and not be too bad, but it's a tough apple. It really is. It's never been one of my favorites, but there are 200 different kinds of Red Delicious out there. And when you go to the grocery store, you don't know which one it is that you're getting in rare circumstances. So yeah, it's kind of a weird one.
All right. And I've got a question from Sandy Bressler. I love the idea of doing genealogy of who's behind the particular apples. It will secure their place in history by telling their story. Am I right to understand you'll be writing another book on this type of history?
Yeah.
Is that something we just covered? Is that right?
Yeah, I'm going to do that. That's
Okay.
my project. What I want to make this out to, it's going to be a book that's going to be too unwieldy to publish. The C chapter alone, I'm not quite through it. And I have 140 pages alone of just text on the letter C, if that tells you anything. I want to be able to have this out on the internet. And I hope to start writing a column for the NAFEX magazine to highlight a different apple every publication. I haven't talked to them yet, so well, there's a scoop here, to see if they'd be interested in having that. But I want to have it out there so people can have access to it. I want this out there because it's, you know, the book is fine, but the information is more important, and that I want to have everyone to have access to. That's my goal.
That's great.
Hi, Dan. Was there anything else in particular that you wanted to get to in your presentation? Because the questions are rolling in, and it looks like if you wanted to, you could just spend the rest of your time answering questions.
We could do that. I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah.
Yeah, if there's anything else that you wanted to get to, though, we sure can start there.
Oh, sure. There's just a few stories. I can always tell stories. That's kind of what I like to do these days. So, and that could get kind of tedious. So I'd rather answer questions if people have questions.
All right. All right. Here's a question. It would be interesting to know which apple varieties were adopted by Native Americans. Do you have any knowledge about Native American orchards?
Oh, yeah. Oh, Upper New York State, they were all over the place. A lot of the tribes had picked those up early on, basically with their contact from the French. And so, there was a campaign, of course, when you have the 5 tribes that were partly siding with the British and partly siding with the United States or the Americans. There were campaigns to run into Indian country and basically deprive them of their grains, cut down all their orchards, and they were surprised how big orchards there were back in the early 1800s. They were very established and all through there. It was a very important food source for the Native Americans to have. And so orchards existed all over, and seeds were spread, and they just naturally hybridized themselves all over the place. So yeah, it's very important. There were the tribes all down the southeast coast that had apples. If you get to, there's a lot of named varieties that I could dig up that were done by a couple of southern pomologists, and they were all basically grown by the Cherokee and many of the tribes. You know, you look at like Wisconsin, there were like 26 different Native American tribes in just the state of Wisconsin alone. If you get down in the southeast and the Atlantic states, all over the place. So orchards existed all over this country as soon as apples came in and they were able to spread them. The Native Americans picked them up and really grew the apple. It was really amazing.
I'll just insert here a little note. The people that sent that question and actually live over on Coeur d'Alene Lake. And I happen to know that in the early 1900s, the Department of the Interior set up a nursery for the Coeur d'Alene Indian tribe near the town of Tico, Washington, which is right near the border with Idaho. Okay. And the purpose of the nursery was to train the Native Americans on the nursery business. So that's just a little side note there. Let's go on to the next question. And from John, I'm not sure if you're going to do this, but it would be interesting to hear about your experience with hard cider production and the history of this in the United States. I'm a home brewer and have been dabbling in cider this year. I know that many of the pre-Prohibition apple varieties were selected for their cider attributes rather than their fresh fruit attributes.
Oh yeah, yeah. Cider was it. Cider was why most people grew apples to begin with. For fresh use, sure, that was important, but really it was about the cider, about the alcohol. That was the thing. If you could clear enough land to plant, you couldn't maybe have cultivatable land to do grain or anything like that. But if you could grow apples, you could scratch out a spot and grow a tree pretty easily. And it really was for cider production. I was reading about yesterday, there was a family that moved from Rhode Island down to Rumson, I'm thinking of Delaware or something like that. Anyways, this was in the 1600s, and I found a copy of his will, and in the estate inventory, it lists 111 barrels of cider. It was spelled S-I-D-D-E-R at the time, but they packed cider away. They drank it morning, noon, and night. Kids would have it. I mean, I would love to see our politicians basically have a big glass of cider in the morning before they went to work. And civility might be one of those things that comes out of it. But yeah, it was all about the cider. I started making cider because I was growing so many apples, I had to do something with it. And it's seriously fun. It's seriously easy. It's one of those things I said before, the more you know about it, the harder it is. I took a course with Peter Mitchell at Cornell University on advanced cider making, not the beginning class, but the advanced one, where you can know more about it, the chemistry and all the things that are in it. And it's frankly kind of scary, but it's really fun to do, and it's so simple. Everyone should learn to make their own cider. The best thing is have the best mix of apples possible. Many different kinds that you can find to throw in there, because what one doesn't have, another does, and it just really makes for a well-rounded cider. A friend of mine is a apple collector that scrounges the hillsides all around here looking for varieties, and we found a real nice one. He found a real nice one. I won't take credit for this one, that I tested out at about 26 degrees Brix, which is insanely sweet, and it yet is as pungent as a Pitmaster pineapple for flavor. So what a great combination that is. He has tentatively named it the Ace of Spades, so it's a good one. Yeah, I don't want to play poker with that one, but super fun to grow your own apples and or make your own cider. It is so easy. Basically, you just need to have a few basic tools and be clean about your work. How you make it is up to you, but there's a lot of techniques to do it, but it's so much fun. Go for it. I used to my background is I used to run a cider press, commercial press for 24 years. It was a old, I'm going to say Mount Gilead press from Ohio, and you could put 15 bushels of apples in it at a time. So you could get about 40 some gallons in about 20 minutes. It was great. So I made cider for all the commercial orchards in my area, plus for myself, which was super fun. Okay, anyways.
Okay. Richard writes, how did Europeans transport the apple cultivars they wished to grow to North America? Did they bring cyanwood, small grafted trees, etc.? And how common was this as opposed to just bringing seeds?
Seeds were the easiest way. I think one of the earliest documented references to bringing trees over was the second Jamestown trip in 1609, 1608 or 1609, where they actually brought potted fruit trees with them. And so they were established in Jamestown, which the first group, I guess, passed on. They didn't survive the winter, but the second expedition that came through did. By 1623, we had apples along the East Coast. There were different orchards set up in Massachusetts and such. So yeah, we've had stuff from early on, but they did bring trees, which you would think would be a month at sea voyage to have a tree that survived. That's kind of a trick. Because they didn't go typically in the dead of winter, because that's a pretty tough voyage, but they could keep a tree alive. That was a undertaking that I would love to see how they did it.
Yes.
Okay.
Are there any notable stories or history regarding Pennsylvania cultivars? And this is Ben who's asking this, and he's particularly interested in the new discovery of the Buttersweet of Pennsylvania.
Oh, the Buttersweet, yeah. There's a ton of butter apples out there, and that's one of the Buttersweet is one I know I've run across. I'd have to look at that, and if there's a way for you to contact me through this, I would love to be able to do a little research and then get back to you about what I know about it and any stories. There are a fair amount of stories of Pennsylvania varieties. One of my favorites is the iconic Smokehouse, really nice old variety, and it was named for the fact that the tree grew near a smokehouse, and it's a really tasty one. It's not much for looks, but I think that's the thing that I've been able to get past is I don't care what it looks like, it's what's inside. That's the joy of it. So forget about shiny and pretty and all that stuff. I love the ones that look like shoebox cardboard, kind of look on the outside, because what's inside is just fabulous. So get over that shiny business. Jeez.
I can't testify that buttersweet is a very good tasting apple, though.
Yeah.
All right, well, I'll move on here. An orchard in my area has an oral history that is populated by apples brought back by the family whenever they came from Italy. It was in the 1800s or sometime in the 1900s. Do you think they had to go through the USDA or anything like that?
Has this been done recently now?
No, this would have been done in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
They just brought stuff over. They didn't care. The USDA wasn't really involved with any of that stuff. So unfortunately, we did bring a lot of bad things over here, I guess, and vice versa. So no, they just brought stuff over. It didn't really matter. They just dealt with it. I think a lot of it was, of course, that then they would plant trees and then they ran into problems with pests and they kept moving the orchards farther west. Iowa, where I'm at here, used to be the 4th largest producer of apples once upon a time. Well, that was a while ago. Because it was a source that they could get them to the Chicago markets or to the Chicago Railroad and then ship them east. So these orchards, if they got planted, the pests hadn't caught up to them yet. And so they were able to keep ahead of it by planting new orchards farther and farther and farther west until they basically ran out of room on the Pacific.
All right, thank you, Dan. E.B. Jenkins asks you this. Somewhere in an apple book, I read that the Summer Rambo was a favorite of Johnny Appleseed. Have you heard this?
Yeah, I've heard that. Yeah, he was. Now, the interesting thing is Johnny Appleseed, of course, planted orchards all over the place. He had nurseries set up up and down the Ohio River. In fact, he was probably one of the wealthiest landowners in the Ohio Valley, but you would never know it. He lived like a pauper. But he never grafted a tree in his life. He thought that was abhorrent. He wouldn't have anything to do with it. So everything that he had was a seedling. So he may have run across the Summer Rambo and it was a favorite of his, but he would have never grafted it to produce, keep it going. He did not believe in that. He was, that was bad. So he stayed away from anything that had to do with grafting. It's all seedlings.
Thank you. All right, and Nancy asks, what's the best way to track the most likely cultivars in a particular region of Washington during a particular time period? I want the most likely candidates in an orchard planted in 1860 on San Juan Island, which was a territory disputed by both the US and the English. So some varieties could be from Canada, some could be from the US. One of these old trees seems like Domain to Orchard Society folks by the appearance of the apple.
Yeah. That's some of the things that we're trying to find out is those apples that moved and got out wherever they did. I mean, you look at some of the old catalogs, the early ones that we can find, and you see a particular group of apples in that you see basically all over the country that moved. So many varieties never moved more than 50 miles from where they originated. But why did these certain ones seem to get picked up and taken? It's rather interesting. I know there was a small nursery in central Wisconsin in the mid 1880s, I believe. And all of a sudden, a few years later, I found all those same varieties in a nursery in Oregon. They were all out there. So stuff moved. A lot of stuff got out there. So it's really hard to track exactly what, because it's a pretty extensive list, more than we probably care to know. Yeah, it would be obviously a New England variety. I don't know about that much from Canada, frankly. It wasn't as, I think, developed as or easy to get across the Rockies until later on. So the southern route coming up the coast, of course, was probably the easiest way. Of course, there's a wonderful collection of apples on Salt Spring Island on British Columbia, but that'll be a hard one to track down exactly, for sure. But we could probably put a list together that'd be appropriate for that time frame out there.
Yeah, if I might interject here, Nancy. Henderson Llewellyn was the first nurseryman in the West, and he came out in 1847, went to Oregon. And so probably most of the apple trees came from south of Portland during the 1860s. And in the 1860s, I don't know much about the history in the San Juan Islands, but I do know quite about eastern Washington, kind of in the Walla Walla area. And nurseries opened up in Walla Walla in 1858 and 1860 and 61. And I've got lists of nursery stock from those nurseries. I also have nursery catalogs from the early 1900s of Oregon nurseries. And if you want to contact me through the Lost Apple Project Facebook page, I can supply you with a list. But yeah, basically we're talking about hundreds of varieties. Yeah. Well over 200 varieties of apples were grown just in eastern Washington, northern Idaho. But and one other thing that you can do is go to the biodiversity.org website and stick in the name of a town that's close to you, like Seattle, and ask for a Seattle nursery catalog, and then stick in a number like, or a year like 1900 or 1895. And the biodiversity website has many old nursery catalogs from the early 1900s and some even in the late 1800s. And that, it's not going to help you really with the 1860 planting, because I don't think any catalogs were available back then, but you might see some varieties that could have been planted there. Okay,
I'll throw something. Okay, I'll throw something in as well. Henderson Llewellyn came from Iowa, and he was in the southeast part of it, and he would have likely had contact with another nurseryman by the name of Gustavus Benson Brackett, who had a nursery in Denmark, Iowa, at about that time frame. He ended up working for the USDA later on. So I have lists, I think, of what Brackett was growing at that time, and those would likely be the same varieties that made it out west with the Llewellyns. And of course, Henderson's son ended up having a nursery then in Milwaukee, Oregon. And I don't know whether there's an old catalog of those that's out there that would maybe have a lot of those same varieties that he had listed a little bit later, but somewhat similar, because they hung on to things a little longer back at that time. They weren't quick to replace it with the next new thing a year later. They kind of held on to the same varieties. I think we could put together a pretty good list. Okay. Based on what I know would have come from Iowa to have gone out there.
All right. Let's see. Dan, how do you identify an apple you find in an old unattended orchard?
That is so hard. I got to turn it over to John Bunker on this one. You know, when you've looked at so many thousands of different apples, I mean, case in point, when I had to go select the best illustration to go with the variety in the book that I have, there were 1,452 different distinct apple varieties, but there were 3,500 different paintings done of them. So I had to sort through every single one to find the best example. And I always chose the one that came from closest to where it originated, so it'd be the same. But anyways, it's tough because they look so much alike. So you have to, there's those ones that really are iconic, that really stick out. It's a slow process. I think I always say that I can always tell you what it isn't, but what it is another matter. I got lucky a couple of years ago. When I first moved out here into Iowa and took this job at the Seed Savers, there was an old iconic orchard in Decorah called the Lohman Orchard. It had been around since the late 1800s. He was big with the Iowa Horticulture Society and whatnot. And there was just a remnant of that orchard left. Back in 89, they had done a survey of it and found all the trees that existed. And the last owner of the orchard identified every single one. The Seed Savers, unfortunately, did not get cuttings from those trees. So when I got back there 20 years later, I was able to find the original orchard, and there was one tree that was the biggest apple tree I've ever seen in my entire life. It had to be 4 foot deep. It was 4 foot thick, monster of a tree, and one branch sticking up a little ways above my head was the tip of an aluminum tag that had been put there when it was planted. It was half buried, and yet I managed to get it out and it was still legible. It turned out to be an old variety called Yankee that doesn't exist anywhere else. We got cuttings. 2 years later, the owner of the property bulldozed everything that was down there, but we got cuttings of everything. So we get lucky once in a while, and that's a given when you have actually a name tag that's still on the tree. But don't count on that. It doesn't happen. So it's a lot of patience. Having a trained palate, I think, is a good thing, so you can pick up the nuances on flavor. Certainly, the color is important, and the shape of the fruit, the core outline, all those little characteristics, and yet it's still a guess. What we look at is what were the market lists of apples in your area at a particular time. If you can tell how old the tree is, you might be able to start putting the little pieces together. It's tough. It really is. We're hung up on names. I guess if it's a good apple, enjoy it, whether you know what it is or not.
Very true. Okay, Bridget writes, the Phillips Pippin is from Eastnor Castle in Herefordshire and is illustrated in your book. I have contacted them and they no longer have old orchards. Any chance of finding a lost apple which might have survived in the US? P.S. Pitmaston pineapple is my favorite apple too.
Good to know. Good, good. That's an interesting trick. Obviously, somebody grew it in this country. What we look at is there was an Englishman that lived in Missoula, Montana, of all places, who introduced all kinds of English apples to that area. Something would come out in England, and within 2 years, he had it in Missoula, Montana, back in the 1800s. And that to me is incredible. So I would love to find out. I forget the name of the gentleman, to see whether any remnants of his orchard or anything like that still exist. But it's possible. And the Phillips Pippin may likely be in it, or at least the seedling thereof.
And I know we have some people connected with this webinar who live in Montana and might be able to check on something in Montana too, if we come up with something.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. I think establishing these networks of interested growers and people who are just searching for apples, much like you are, David, and here, and John Bunker in Maine and different places around the country, we're going to come up with stuff. We're going to find things, and so that's the beauty of this. So I think hopefully my book is of some use to people, because at least they might know what's out there, what potentially they could find. So I hope. I'm not trying to put a plug in for it, but the more you know, the more the possibilities exist.
Absolutely. All right. Let's see. Here's a question. Suggestion for acquiring heirloom scion wood in California. I can help with that, and that's both the Lost Apple Project and the Temperate Orchard Conservancy will be selling scion wood this spring. So if you contact either the Facebook page for the Lost Apple Project or go to the Temperate Orchard Conservancy website, you'll find out more. I think we're going to be posting our scions about January 1st. Okay, let's see. Somebody asked if biodiversity.org is the right name of the website. It doesn't load. Just Google it, biodiversity.org, and then Google it. It should, if you have trouble with that, you can contact me through the Lost Apple Project. Let's see. Oh, Dan, what is the name of the book that you're writing right now?
I don't know yet. I haven't figured that one out. I had thought with malice aforethought. That kind of came up to mind.
How about Dan's Big Book of Apples?
Yeah, that sounds like it's going to be on that remainder shelf at your local bookstore in about 6 months.
Okay, let's see. Someone's asking a permission for Dan Bussey to use their email info. Dan, do you have an email address that you could provide to folks who want to get in direct contact with you?
I would love to chat with anybody anytime. My email address is a really tough one, ciderdan@gmail.com. CIDERDAN
Very
at
good. Very good.
gmail.com. Yeah.
All right. I think, have we reached the end of the questions, Kyle?
It is looking like, oh, we just had one more come in.
There was one that somebody posted about the Bear Creek Nursery in Northport, Washington, that closed unfortunately some years ago. There was a thought about someone coming in to keep it going, but I've never heard anything ever happen from it. And that's too bad. That was a really favorite source of mine for old varieties and very interesting things. Would love to find out what happened to the property, if nothing else.
You know, it did open up a couple of years ago, but it's nothing like it was before.
Oh, okay.
I don't believe they put out a catalog or anything like that. It's pretty small operation.
Yeah.
Okay, Kyle, do you see any other questions that we?
I think that looks like you've covered them all.
Dan, you've covered every question there is about apples. Thank you.
Oh boy. Well, I'm glad we had at least three people listening in today. No, I don't know how many were, but I'm pretty tickled. Yeah.
It's
well, thank you so much, Dan, for doing this and also just your work over the years. I mean, I can't imagine what the future would be like looking for apple varieties without your book. Oh, and just a note also, Dan mentioned that he used a lot of old books. If you didn't catch the name, let's see. I know he used Apples of New York. Oh, were there a couple? Oh, American Plumology, was that another one?
Yeah, the one from John Ashton Warder.
Yeah, and anyone can go online now. All those old books are out of copyright. So you can go right on the internet and you can actually download those books and have them on your computer because it's over 100 years and copyright has expired on. They're wonderful old books, and there's a lot more than that too out there. But
I want to put a plug in for a good book on researching old varieties and in a particular area, and this is really recent. This is John Bunker's book, Apples and the Art of Detection. It just came out a year or so ago, and it's a fabulous read and great stories about the hunt that John had for finding these iconic Maine varieties. And I'd love to see something like that happen in like every single state. I just think it's pretty amazing. A lot of great pictures and a lot of good information. So it's just a fabulous book. So there's some really nice stuff that's out there. So these sources are available, and I know we all love to talk to you. It's a really small community. I had the pleasure of knowing Tom Burford and Creighton Lee Calhoun before they passed away, and we were on a conference together, and I did a grafting clinic with Tom Burford in Utah for the National Park Service. And you know, to get to know these old guys and the stories they had to tell and the fun they had, it's really been fun. So I'm really enthused that we have so many interested people that are trying to keep on these things that these guys had started. So I know this is going to keep going. We're going to find this stuff, and we're going to be able to bring out a lot of really fun varieties that we've hopefully just not lost.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, and thank you for everyone who has attended.
Yeah, and we have 5 minutes left. If you have one more favorite apple story you'd like to tell.
There's a good old one, kind of a scary one. It's more fitting for Halloween. It's called the Micah root apple. Back in Connecticut in the 1600s, there was a old farmer by the name of Micah Root. He was not very particularly well liked. Anyways, he was kind of a curmudgeon. Well, anyways, a traveling salesman happened to wander through, and apparently he was like selling jewelry, and he had a case with him. And so he camped out at Micah Root's farm, And the next day they found him dead. His valuables were missing and he was laying dead underneath an apple tree. And ever since that time, this apple tree, when you cut open the apples, the core was blood red. And they thought that was because it symbolized the fact that this man had been stabbed to death and left underneath the tree. And for years to come, this tree bore apples that had a blood red core. And the fun part about it is I tracked the people down. They do exist, or they did exist. It's a true story.
Really? Did they have an apple name for it?
They called it the Micah root apple. That's named after the farmer. And so afterwards, they never could prove it. And he was sort of shunned by the community, and he withdrew even more until he finally died a few years later. So that's the story.
That's pretty scary, all right.
Yeah. That's one to end on for nightmares for everyone.
Yeah, just what we need in time for Christmas. Nothing happy here.
PG-13, you know.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks for all the work you've done, Dan. We really appreciate you putting on this presentation today.
My pleasure.
And we hope to be able to get you in on future conferences if we're going to hopefully do more in person in the future, but we would definitely like to include you one way or another. So
appreciate that. That's fun. Yeah. Anytime.
Heck yeah. Well, thank you everyone for attending. We had around 100 people on today's webinar, so wow. another great turnout. Join us next month. It'll be on January 20th. We're going to have Jude from Montezuma Orchard Project, and it's going to be moderated by Katrina Mendre of Montana State University. And the topic is community-led efforts to conserve orchards and fruit in the West. So please join us next month, and thank you for joining us for today.
There was a note from Katrina just, Don, about the Englishman from Missoula, and it was named Colville. They have it right. So H.B. Colville. If you can find where he was, I think it might be interesting.
Definitely.
All right.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next month.
Okay.